Standing in this street less than an hour ago, Boris Johnson declared that there are no circumstances in which he would ask Brussels to delay Brexit. He warned Conservative backbench MPs, some of whom were serving in the cabinet until this summer, that if they vote with the opposition for what he said would be yet another pointless delay, they would chop the legs from under his negotiations with the EU. He said he didn't want an election, but he didn't explain what he would do if he loses in the Commons this week. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, joins us right now. Gary.
Well, why, you might be wondering, was Boris Johnson emphasising this point, I will not seek a delay? And it's because of the bill that Tory rebels with opposition parties, we now have it, are planning to pass in the Commons, starting the whole process tomorrow. And in this bill there is a post-dated letter effectively for Boris Johnson to sign, little gap left for his signature, in which if they win and there is no deal, he is required to ask the EU, sign on the dotted line for an extension of the Brexit date up to the 31st of January. And if the EU turns around and says, actually, do you know what, mate, we want to push that back a lot further, after 2 days, he's got to say yes to that as well. So this is a horror show as far as hardline Brexiteers are concerned. And what he's decided to do in response to it is to table a motion in the House of Commons saying, if this passes, then we will move to the process which could trigger an early general election. That motion would require, under the laws that were passed by David Cameron and the coalition, would require 2/3 of MPs to support that. So the bulk of the opposition parties need to come on side. And that is a question that they're going to be scratching their heads about, because as you were talking to Tony Blair earlier, Tony Blair was saying in a speech today, any early election is a massive trap. But I think, given that the date that the government seem to be thinking about is a date in the first half of October, just before the European Council, which would decide whether there is a deal that can be changed from the one Theresa May negotiated, because the date is there just ahead of the European Council, it's going to be very hard for the Labour leader, reluctant as he might be, or some around him might be, to walk away from that snap election if Boris Johnson puts the motion down. Of course, Theresa May, the last occupant of this building, knows snap elections can go extremely badly. But right now, at this moment, we could be looking at another one.
Demonstrators at the end of Downing Street slightly through Boris Johnson's delivery. With his message delivered after an emergency cabinet, Tory rebels must not join forces with opposition MPs to force another delay on the Brexit date.
To show our friends in Brussels that we are united in our purpose, MPs should vote with the government against Corbyn's pointless delay. I want everybody to know there are no circumstances in which I will ask Brussels to delay.
So what would he do if Parliament passed a bill this week requiring him to demand another delay on Brexit? All signs point to him trying to call an election instead. Now, he was determined to plant the blame for that, if it happens, on his opponents.
Let's let our negotiators get on with their work without that sword of Damocles over their necks and without an election. Without an election. I don't want an election. You don't want an election. Let's get on with the people's agenda.
Jeremy Corbyn has opposed any general election date that allows no deal to happen in the middle of it. But if the election is before the Brexit date, he may feel he has to back it. His Brexit election pledge: Labour will give you a second referendum.
In that election, Labour will give people the chance to take back control and have the final say in a public vote with credible options on both sides, including the option to remain.
At the heart of any Tory election strategy will be winning Brexit Party voters over. And only last week, the Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage said he might stand aside to help a Boris Johnson-led Tory party if it was committed to no deal.
Together, we'd be unstoppable, and Boris would have a huge majority and go down as one of the great heroes in British history.
Some long-standing Tories think Boris Johnson could win with Brexit Party support, but the party's identity would change forever.
They are aping Nigel Farage, and they are now absolutely single-minded that they're going to kick him out of the way by becoming him. Now, of course, ultimately, that doesn't kick him out of the way, it just puts him in charge. And all of the people like me and Ruth Davidson and David Gauke and Rory Stewart and Antoinette Sandbach, who supported a modern, compassionate, progressive version of conservatism, will have to look for a new home and a new place to put our votes.
Only 2 months ago, they were attending Cabinet. Today, Boris Johnson said these and other former ministers who vote for a Brexit extension could be thrown out of the party.
I do worry about where the Conservative Party might be going. There was a piece in one of the national newspapers recently calling for a purge of people like me. A senior former cabinet minister endorsed this. I didn't see the party chairman refute it. This is not good. It's not where a political, broad-based party ought to be.
Tony Blair today warned Jeremy Corbyn to oppose any early election plans, as they were an elephant trap that would hurt Labour and pro-Europeans.
But my bet is the Brexit Party will collapse them. The Labour Party at present will struggle. A resurgent Lib Dems will do well, but not well enough to govern. The opposition vote, therefore, is going to split. And under our system, that delivers a comfortable Tory majority.
Thank you.
The number 10 team hopes Tony Blair's election punditry is right. Some Tory MPs who gathered in the number 10 garden believe they could be fighting for re-election within days. The risk would be another snap election, producing a hung parliament and Brexit still in limbo.
Well, joining us now is the Conservative MP Antoinette Sandbach, who is just outside the House of Commons. Antoinette Sandbach, you are going to vote for the Hillary Benn bill. You'll also vote against a snap election. That is, in a sense, signing the death warrant on your Conservative ambitions of ever continuing as an MP.
Yes, it is, but I'm elected to act in the best interests of my constituents, many of whose jobs are on the line with a no deal Brexit. The International Trade Observatory estimates 80,000 job losses in the northwest, and key northwest sectors, car manufacturing, chemicals industry, nuclear industry and pharmaceuticals, will be hit by a no deal Brexit.
Now, do you have any sense of exactly how many people are going to support your bill?
I do have a sense, but I'm not going to disclose it, I'm afraid.
Now, you are a committed Remainer. Have you come under enormous pressure from your former colleagues?
I'm not a committed Remainer. I voted for the Prime Minister May's deal to leave the European Union on the 29th of March with the withdrawal agreement. I did that respecting the referendum result in my constituency, but I have always said that I would not support a no-deal Brexit, which is the worst possible outcome for this country.
Well, how confident are you tonight that you could just get this bill through?
Well, I very much hope that we will get this bill through, because if the Prime Minister is able to deliver a deal, and I very much hope that he does deliver a deal, then we will need a short technical extension in order to pass the legislation that's required, much of it which will be killed off by the prorogation of Parliament.
You know, he's saying that if your bill goes ahead, he will have no option but to call an election.
Well, I think he's angling for that. He's taken a very confrontational approach, both with Parliament and indeed with colleagues in his own party, and I feel that it is really important that we make this stand tomorrow.
You know, I was standing here about an hour ago, and the Prime Minister was standing at his lectern just there, and he said, if this bill becomes law, I will ignore the law.
Well, I wouldn't advise anybody to ignore the law, and it shows the importance.
But what are your options if he does?
Well, clearly he would be acting ultra vires outside his powers as Prime Minister if he ignored the law. And that's why the legislative route is so terribly important, because he could ignore motions of the House of Commons. He knows that there is no majority in the House of Commons for a no deal. In fact, there were hundreds of votes against a no deal back in the last parliamentary session.
Antonio Sandbach, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, now, the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, has warned Jeremy Corbyn of the risk of an election, calling it an elephant trap. So I spoke to him earlier, and I began by asking him whether he would vote for Mr Corbyn if it meant stopping a No Deal Brexit.
Look, I've always said it's a struggle for me because of a whole lot of other policies of the Labour Party and because of the way the Labour Party's behaved over certain issues, particularly anti-Semitism. But I would, in an election, which I think is the wrong thing to do, but if there was an election specifically on the question of no deal Brexit, I would do whatever is the best way of stopping no deal Brexit, including voting Labour if that was the way to do it.
But how incredible that a former Prime Minister says that a general election, we are after all a representative democracy, is the wrong way to resolve an absolutely cataclysmic crisis.
Yeah, but it is the wrong way because for the very reason that your first question suggests, which is a general election is an election as the government of the day, and the Brexit question will be mixed up with a whole lot of other questions. The right way to resolve Brexit is indeed to go back to the people, but you go back to the people directly on the Brexit question.
But that's not going to heal the country, is it?
Well, what else is going to heal the country? If we supposing we crash out, Parliament's circumvented, we crash out with no deal on the 31st of October, when you cannot seriously argue that June 2016 is a clear mandate for a no-deal Brexit. What do people think is going to be the state of the country after that? And supposing, by the way, even a fraction of the warnings on no-deal Brexit turn out to be correct, we could have been 6 months in a situation where there's, the country's in constitutional meltdown.
With the knowledge of having been a Prime Minister, how do you view the way our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is dealing with this?
But Boris Johnson is Boris Johnson, so there's a lot of vim and vigour and dash and flash and all of that. And the risk he's taking with the country is a risk that I would never, ever want to take as Prime Minister. And the one thing I think he should really do in these next few weeks is leave aside all the issues about whether he could win an election or he couldn't win an election. Just think what's going to happen if you really crash out with no deal and it turns out on the bad side of the risk spectrum.
There are many people who will have thought of you, thought of the days when your moral authority was second to none, and then look at the Iraq War and say that disables him completely.
Yeah, and if people say that, then that's their right. And I say to them,
But don't you feel today, if only I didn't have that against me, I could do something now?
In the end, what I say to people about this is you can decide whether you think I did the wrong thing and so on and so forth, and that's up to you. But this is an issue for the country I feel so strongly on. Maybe it's because I've now got grandchildren. I'm not going to have a situation where people in 20, 30 years' time turn around and say, well, what the hell were you doing? Why weren't you were Prime Minister for 10 years. You weren't telling people this was a bad idea. It's such a bad idea. I mean, I wake up every morning with this Brexit thing, sometimes in despair, sometimes in rage, and sometimes just thinking, what do we have to do? Because it's a profound historical mistake for the country. It solves nothing. It isolates us in a world where we need to be engaged. And then we are separating ourselves. And for what? For this myth that Europe controls what we do. And look at all these promises Boris Johnson is making on the health service, on education, on law and order, on spending, an end to austerity. Which one of those promises depends on leaving Europe? None of them. We make our decisions not in Brussels, but in Britain. And this is what's so crazy. For this distraction, we're going to pay such a heavy price for future generations. So I understand people don't want to listen to me, that's fine. But I honestly, on this, I'm going to speak. Even if I'm addressing one person, I'm going to speak.
Tony Blair, thank you very much for talking to us. Well, we did ask the government for an interview tonight with a minister, but no one was available.